Hey guys, kinggath here with Bethesda Mod School. In this series, I'm going to start going over some of the new stuff I've added to Workshop Framework, and then eventually I'll go back over and talk about some of the older stuff. So with the recently released, at the time of this video recording, Workshop Framework 2.0.0 patch, I took a new direction with Workshop Framework. So when I initially launched it, it was designed for coders. Now it's starting to get designed in the same way that SimSettlements was, which is designed for anybody at all who wants to use it and add stuff to it, can do so with just a minimal amount of knowledge about the creation kit. And so with this series, I'm going to start covering some of those to get those of you guys who just want to take advantage of these features, create some cool stuff with almost no knowledge whatsoever. In fact, I think the only requirements to this tutorial would be the creation kit section of the Bethesda Mod School. So CK 101, 102, 103, just a handful of those first 4 or 5, I think will teach you enough to get through most of this lesson. So the first thing that I've already set up most of this in this particular plugin. I'm just going to walk you through what I did rather than walking through the steps fresh, mostly because I didn't want to make mistakes on the video and then have you guys listen to me ramble as usual as I try and figure things out. So what I've done here is I duplicated the AAA marker cell. And again, a lot of this stuff you will find in my previous lessons, but to do that, you just right click this and hit duplicate cell. We went into our copy. Then I selected all the items that Bethesda had here in this window, clicked back over here, hit delete to get rid of them. And then I created this little platform here. This is something I just like to do just so I can keep an eye on where the center of my cell is at any given moment. And also if I'm building static collections, again, something covered in those creation kit early tutorials, this will catch them if the physics go awry and they fall down. So I always call this my catch platform, but I also use it to orient myself to the center of the cell. So the next thing I did was I placed this table in here, and what we're going to be doing today is working with the new ClutteredItem script. And the idea with this script is you can apply it to a workshop item that the player can build, and it will clutter that item for the player. So you as the mod author are going to decide a couple of things. You're going to decide where different clutter will appear on the surface, and you get to decide what type of clutter will appear in each of those positions. And then the Workshop Framework code will handle randomizing it for the player. It will handle re-randomizing it later if you choose to do so, and when the player re-arrives at their settlement, that the clutter will be rolled again so that it looks like the person is living there and changing things. And you also have a couple of you've got one other control option to allow it to actually only appear occasionally, so you can have it so that only 50% of the time the clutter gets used, and that way it will feel more alive, and you can choose that percentage to whatever you want. So I'll walk you through how to set up that script, but all of that is handled by Workshop Framework. All you have to do is focus on picking whatever object. It doesn't have to be a table, it could be a shelf, it could be a piece of floor, it could be literally anything you want, and you choose where clutter will appear, and then you're going to choose what types of clutter could appear in each position. So what I've started with is I'm going to set up a little table here, and I put a Nuka-Cola bottle and a noodle cup here. Now, one of the things that's cool with this clutter system is it can actually accept anything at all. It doesn't have to be a static item. So for those of you guys familiar with SimSettlements, you know that we tend to create a lot of statics, a lot of static collections, which those can still work with this system. But this system will actually convert at runtime anything you use at all. So we can go ahead and just use the potion items here, and they will work just fine. This is something different in the Workshop Framework implementation than the SimSettlements. So those of you who know how to do both, this is just a more advanced version, mostly because I've learned a lot more since I did the SimSettlements version. So, and that you're going to find that common whenever I implement something. For those of you who are SimSettlements add-on experts, whenever I implement a similar thing in Workshop Framework, it's going to be it's going to be a different version. I was going to say more robust, but in this case, some of it is a little simplified, but the back-end code is a little more advanced to it. So you might have less options to control it up front. I'll probably add more in the future, but it will handle things a little more gracefully because I just know more. So the idea here is we're picking positions to where we want our clutter item there. Now we don't obviously want just Nuka-Cola or noodles to appear there, because if it was going to be the same thing every single time, well, we could just build ourselves a static collection. There's no need to do this cluttered item system. So the real power from the cluttered items is the randomization. So one of the things you'll notice about Bethesda's items is they tend to share an origin point that makes sense. And by origin point, I mean this little yellow point right here. And that is where the item will appear when it's in the world. This is where when an item is placed in the world, it's the origin point is placed, that yellow point is placed down at the same spot every time. So if we look at this item here and we swap it with something else, when it swaps, that item that gets swapped with it will be placed with its yellow point matching the yellow point of this item. And one of the coolest ways to check out what I mean by that is to use a little thing in the creation kit, a little hotkey. If you hold down Alt and scroll your mouse wheel, it will actually move or swap out the item with the origin point remaining the same. And so you can see, like, the noodles have the same position, all the Nuka-Colas share the same position. If we scroll back up to, let's see, if we get up to G, we can get to the Gwinnett. But you see a lot of the food has the same origin point. A lot of the chems, there's some Instamash. A lot of the stuff is all interchangeable about where it would exist in the game world if it were placed at the same coordinates. And so you can use this little alt scroll trick to figure out what items could be in the pool for any particular position you choose, and they could all work interchangeably and make it look effective when randomization has occurred. So you can use this little trick to quickly get an idea of what type of items could share a position, because not every item will work. You've seen plenty of items that are clipping through the table, but almost certainly some of those items will share the origin point of several others so that they could be put in a list together and used effectively with randomization. So what we're going to assume with this is we're going to say we want, whenever this table is placed, we want a beverage to appear here and a food item to appear here. So I've already gone off camera and come up with some lists. I'm going to show you those now. So we're going to go into miscellaneous form list, and we're going to search for WSFW demo, and you'll see I've created random clutter drinks and random clutter food. And I found a handful of items that all share the same origin with the ones I used as my examples. So we've got those set up there. So now we've got our kind of position data figured out. We know exactly, like, all of this right here, this stuff's not going to get used in the game. The whole purpose of this extra cell and all this stuff was just to kind of plan, basically, is what this was for. So now we're going to create our actual item. Now, once again, I've already created my item, and I'm just going to walk you back through the steps I used to create it, but I will talk a little bit more about that. So I went with an activator type, and generally something like this, like a table like this, would actually be a static. But because we need to attach a script, we can't use a static. Static objects are one of the few types in the creation kit that can't have a script on them. So we went with activator, and to convert an activator into a virtual static, all you have to do is add the block player activation and check in ignored by sandbox. And then basically it will lose that interaction that you normally have on an activator type, where it says activate when you walk up to it, and it will still have the same physics of a static item. It will be treated like a static for all intents and purposes in the game from the player's perspective. So, but we are allowed to have a script on there. So I went ahead and named it whatever I needed to make sure it has a unique ID. I named it Cluttered Table. I got the model path by opening up the actual static that we used for this, and I click Edit here. I can copy and paste this path here, and then go into Edit and just paste that in right there to get that. I also copied the preview transform from here. This happened to be an object that was buildable in workshop mode, so it had a nice preview transform setup. Because we're building a workshop item, we're going to want to make sure we have a workshop or some sort of preview transform. The workshop selection has a very wide variety, and there's pretty much one that would work for any type of item you're building. You just got to find one that works well for you. And unfortunately, I haven't found a great way to determine in the creation kit if it's going to work well, because this window here does not reflect the scale of things when it's in the game. So you just kind of get an eyeball for it over time as you've been doing this long enough, that what looks an appropriate scale. Something like a box I'm drawing with my mouse here is about the size of the space in workshop mode that it will fill, but you'll kind of get your feel for it as you go. So we've got our block player activation and our ignore by sandbox. Then after you set all that up, you hit OK. Then you open it back up after it created the form, and you'll be able to attach this script. So we go to, when I do scripts, I tend to do it through this. You can also just click Add and do it. But I go to Gameplay and then Papyrus Manager. This is a little slow the first time you do it, and then it opens up real quickly each time after that. And we're going to go ahead and search for Clutter. or we'll search for cluttered. I think it's cluttered item. Here we go. And then you're going to just take this and drag and drop it on here. Alternatively, you can do it from this add window, search for cluttered item. Now I've already got that on here, so it's not showing up in this particular list. And then you can double click on it from this window. So 2 different ways to do that. So once you've got your cluttered item script added on there, we're going to pop it open and go to properties. And I'm going to talk about what these different properties do, but we're going to skip the middle 2 for now because those are the bulk of what's happening here. Now, if you're watching this and you see you have a lot more options, which might be the case because I love expanding my systems and giving you guys more options as people request them. And as I mentioned earlier, talking about some settlements stuff, the Sim Settlements version of this system is a lot more robust. They have a lot more control, and I'm sure I'll get requests to expand some of those controls to this, and I inevitably will do so because I, again, love giving you guys those control and power over the system when I can. Okay, so this first flag here. Oh, and what I was saying is if you see additional options, I am pretty anal about making sure I fill out this documentation string. So if you click on anything and read down here, it'll tell you what it's going to do. But I'm going to walk you through what these ones do anyway. So basically, by default, every time the settlement reloads, it will change all of the random clutter. It'll pick something different to show, and that is enabled by default. But if you want your particular item to not have that happen, you just want it randomized at the moment it's built, and then to stay that way in perpetuity, you can change this to false. The other option you have currently is to change the appearance chance. So by default, it's 100% chance that all of your clutter nodes will get used. If you change this to say 50, then 50% of the time, no clutter will appear. And the other 50% of the time, clutter will appear, so it can be kind of random. Now, that is only rolled once. This is an efficiency change I made to the code here. In the Sim Settlements world, the randomization can be done a different way. They actually do it, and you can actually still do that with this system. The way they do their randomization to allow a lower percent chance is they use fake items in their randomization list, which we'll talk about the randomization list in a minute. But they put fake items in, and you could do that with this too, basically just invisible items to reduce the appearance chance on a per clutter position basis. But this right here will allow you to just determine, like, hey, you know what? Some of the time I want it to be blank, so it doesn't look like, you know, this NPC is rich and just always has stuff. Especially this can work really well for food type things, like we're setting up here, where it's looking like the settler is eating and drinking. You know, if the player appears every time and the NPC always has a new meal, that NPC looks like they're pretty wealthy and not a wastelander who's suffering. So maybe you only want 20% of the time for them to have food. Whatever you want to do, that is the type of control you have currently. So now we're going to talk about clutter positions. We're going to skip clutter nodes. I'll talk about that at the end, but clutter positions is something everybody watching this can do, even if they don't understand NIF scope, whereas clutter nodes is going to be something that's only for those of you who understand NIF scope or 3D Studio Max. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go into this clutter position. I'm going to show you one of these things, and I'll talk about where I got this data, and then we'll talk about what the randomization lists are. So what this basically is the ability to define a position where clutter should appear. So the reason that we set this up front is so that we can get the relative position data, the position of this particular point where we want food to appear relative to the table. Now, the way we're able to get that data is because we made sure the table was at 0, 0, 0. So this means that whatever data this has right here, once in game, we know that we always want this noodle cup to appear 54 units to the, I think that would be to the left, negative X, to the left of the origin of this table, 2.72 forward on the Y, and 56 units above the origin of the table. So we know that whenever the table gets created, relative to that table, we want this noodle cup to appear at these coordinates, is what that's saying. So don't worry, if you don't understand the math, don't worry about it. Just follow what I'm doing, which is basically you're going to take the data from here by double clicking this and going to 3D data tab. You're going to just copy paste that into POS X, Y, and Z. And then if you change the rotation, you're going to copy any of those you did to X, Y, and Z. Now, if any of these is 0, you don't have to enter them. You can just leave them because they all default to 0. You don't have to mess with those. Scale defaults to 1, so I assume most of you are going to do that. But if you did change the scale, you'll want to update this as well. Force static is not necessary. It's always going to happen. If you leave that at false, it ignores it. I might change that in the future to make it so that force static, you can set it to false to allow the item to actually exist, to where, you know, for example, in the case of our noodles or our Nuka-Cola that it actually places one of those and not a static decoration version. But for now, everything is made static. It's just always going to be a static item. But if I change that, I will do it in a way that retroactively assumes that you wanted it to be static the way I initially released it. So anytime I make updates to these types of systems, I will do them in a way that won't negatively impact people who had already implemented. So I will keep that under consideration as far as giving an option for actually placing the collectible versions of these items. But right now, I'm following the same logic I did with Sim Settlements, is that this would just be super overpowered to just allow the player to continually get more and more stuff, because basically, if that was not static, the player could pick up the table, place it in workshop mode, loot those things, go back into workshop mode, pick up the table, drop it again, it would spawn additional, and then you have an infinite item problem. So that is why, by default, these things are all just made to be static. It was the same thing with Sim Settlements. People could just pick up all the items in the plot, refresh the plot, get new items, repeat, and it was just an exploit I wanted to avoid because the game is already easy enough. We don't need to add in built-in cheats into these mods. Okay, so then the last three fields here, if you followed my stuff much, my scripting stuff much, or my Sim Settlement stuff, this is a common pattern I use. For those of you new to this, basically when you see something like this where there's a form you can fill out, or you can actually enter a form ID and plugin name, I tend to explain that in here. It'll say either this plus form ID or object form, something along those lines. If you click on any of these fields, you'll see I have the same type of stuff. The idea here is object form means you're using something either in your own mod or something in one of the mods that you are willing to make a master. And a master means it's a required mod, a mod the player has to have. So in this case, our mod right now requires Workshop Framework, and it requires Fallout 4 itself. So any items in those two would just be available as an object form. We could select them directly. But if you want to give access to something from another mod, but you don't want your mod to require it, it's kind of like one of those bonus features where it's like, hey player, if you have mod X, you also get this benefit. That is why I like to use this pattern of allowing this, because you can basically fill in this data for an item from that particular mod. And if that mod is detected, it will use it. Otherwise, that will just get skipped. That is how all of my stuff is coded to work. So whenever you see this pattern, you can assume that that's going to work that way. So for the case of this, since we're trying to use our clutter lists, we're going to select from our form type. We'll select form list, and then we'll dig up our food list for this first entry. And basically what's going to happen here is I defined this food list by creating a new form list. And you just, I'm sure you guys know how to do this. If you're following this tutorial, go to form list, right click and hit new, and fill out and just drag and drop items in here that we wanted. So I dragged and dropped all the food items I wanted here. And now what's going to happen is whenever our table is created in workshop mode or in some other form placed by a script or placed from console or whatever, it will, at this position, it's going to generate at random one of these items here. And then every time the player leaves and returns, it's going to replace that item with another random one from that list. So then for our second thing for the drink, we did the exact same steps. We double clicked on our drink, copy pasted all those coordinates here. You can see I did copy the angle as well. And then for that, we choose the drinks list. And that's it. So just by filling out those two little things there and just leaving the default options, we now have a random clutter table. Now the step that I'm not going to show you here is creating the actual constructible item record. There is another lesson for that under the creation kit section. I will try and remember to put a link in the description there directly to that one so you guys can go know how to do that. But otherwise, let's pop in game and see this thing work. All right, so we're in game here, and I went ahead and put this under furniture tables. And okay, well, it's our first item, so we got cluttered table here, so we'll go ahead and build this. And you see we get noodles and some beer. We build it again, and we get deviled eggs, another beer. All about the beer, but it is different beers each time. You can see the labels are slightly different on these. Let's keep going until we get a Nuka-Cola. Noodle and water. Oh, what is going on with that water? Oh, I guess that is how it always looks. I just didn't recognize that weird texture on there. Purified water. Give me Nuka-Cola. There we go. Nuka-Cola and potato chips. What a great lunch. And then if you pick these up, the items will follow with it most of the time. There is an exception to that if you use statics with it or other items that aren't buildable naturally, items that can't normally be moved in the world. The items might disappear temporarily and then reappear, and then once you place it down, it will blink them in and out of existence. This is to fix a physics issue that I discovered in the engine. Any of my patrons will have seen a video of what happens when you move items like this that have physics and you don't flicker them. It ends up causing things in the world to just launch into oblivion, which is pretty funny. But yeah, so the items should travel around as long as they're set up to be. If you have items that aren't normally buildable that you have spawning and you want them to be able to move like this so that the player can see them moving, all you have to do is make sure that they exist in a construction record. They don't even have to be buildable. It could be a scrap construction record. If you don't know how to do that, don't worry about it. It's not that important. I'm sure I'll cover it eventually, but you can probably find a tutorial on how to do that, how to make something scrappable but not buildable, and that is enough to make it movable like this when it's stacked up together. So that's it. And now if we were to leave the area and return, we would come back and see that each of these again had a different thing because I had the clutter left on, but I'm not gonna leave the area and come back because it would take me too long, and there's no way to actually prove to you that it worked from me moving, other than me telling you that I did actually leave the area and come back. So we'll just trust each other that it does work, and you guys will find out for yourselves when you pop in and test this on your own mods. All right, and then finally, before we end, I mentioned I would talk about this Clutter Nodes for those of you guys who know NifScope. So if you know how to create new nodes in NifScope, you can actually reference the names of the nodes you create. So you can create a bunch of unique nodes for those exact positions. So you can actually just set up a node at this position, etc. And then you can just plug those in. So basically you add as many entries, you enter the unique name of the node that you want it positioned at, and then select your form list. Now there is the difference between the Clutter Positions and the Clutter Nodes beyond. It's simpler to enter these in. Is the Positions currently has the advantage of naturally allowing for tapping into other mods. This doesn't yet. I will add that in the future. I've got that on my list to add. Just didn't in the initial implementation. Just an oversight, but I will go back and add that at some point. But for now, I think most of you guys who are going to be using this system, you're going to be using it locally. You're going to want to define those form lists. Like I said, the one point I could see people maybe wanting to take advantage of would be to tap into the Sim Settlements lists of Clutter, since we've already got a system designed around this where they might want to use that. But I think for the most part, this will be just fine. And if you're advanced enough to do the NifScope stuff, you might also be advanced enough to just extend this script yourself and make another version and take care of that. So if I don't get to it before you do. But anyway, real simple. Select your form list, enter your node names, repeat for each node, and it will work effectively the exact same way of this, except you don't have to enter quite as much data. So it's up to you. You can use either way, just don't use both. If nodes are detected, if this field is even filled out, if you even double click this and it's filled out, Workshop Framework will use that data and skip whatever you have in your position. So make sure whichever one you use, the other one is cleared, and you'll be good to go.